that I will start with some misconceptions.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of misconceptions about what it was like during kind of the entirety of COVID in China, that it was extremely strict lockdown, very controlled in a like highly authoritarian manner. And that was not the case. However, when things got bad or there were more cases, Shanghai especially was a really severe instance of kind of locally enforced crackdowns. Then it got really severe, and people would be stuck in their homes, not able to access care or even food at times. There was a lot of like violence actually used to enforce these restrictions, and so those I think there's a lot of variation, especially across different cities and provinces, and how it was enforced. And so, yeah, a misconception is blanket, complete control. That's just not the case. Contrastingly, to get actually closer to your question, so I spent the first maybe 6 months of COVID in between DC and southern Missouri, which is where my family lives now. And as I was waiting for my charter flight to go back to Beijing, it was so important that I didn't get COVID myself, because I wouldn't be able to have my job really. So I was living at home for a few months, working from there, and the attitude locally was, oh, this isn't a real thing. We don't really trust vaccines. No lockdown, no distancing really whatsoever, and kind of attitudes swung very far against it. So I saw a lot of different extremes where China was, although a bit more open at times, it was very extreme approach, to DC kind of much like very US government centric of developing these policies, trying to communicate them. People there were very much on the cautious end. And then total end of the spectrum, kind of deep Midwest of the US, very individual freedoms focused. And it was quite jarring to go between them. And so I tend to like balance. And so I think each side, the ultra control, especially in terms of exerting force, to extreme force at times against one citizens to control this thing in a usually not very scientific manner when that happens, versus the total opposite end of the spectrum of kind of a lot of misinformation, a lot of highly individualistic behavior that did lead to the spread of the disease and worse outcomes for us in the US, I think. So
did you have anyone in your own family who was kind of either a COVID skeptic or just didn't believe in strict social distancing and lockdown measures? Because I feel like having someone like that in your family, whether it's your uncle or grandpa or grandma, it really, you get to see why these kind of COVID measures rollouts, and why is it that in the US and in some parts of the UK they weren't so successful? Because there are actually people who are just like, I'm gonna die on this hill. I don't want to get the vaccine. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. Like, give me my freedoms. I don't believe in this virus.
I actually have a funny anecdote about this. Because I worked at the COVID testing centre, the big mega lab in the UK, as a volunteer, and on the way to the mega lab, the taxi driver was telling me that he doesn't believe in COVID, that it's all 5G, and then he asked me what I was doing, traveling to Milton Keynes in the lockdown, and I was like, I'm going to work at the COVID testing centre. And it was so awkward because he just spent, obviously there's nothing else to talk about. It was such a bizarre place to be in the UK, and that was really awkward.
Did he respond to that, or did it just go silent?
He just stopped talking at that point, because he was just basically like talking about how it was all like these 5G towers, and I was like, oh god. And then he was like, where are you going? And I was like, I'm going to work at the COVID testing centre. And then he was just like, okay, like, so yeah, that's an interesting COVID skeptic thing that I've heard. But did you have anything similar where someone had been like telling you something that was, of an interesting conspiracy theory about COVID? Or
so many. I think both in the US and in China, as I would talk to taxi drivers about their takes on vaccines and which countries' vaccines. But then in Missouri, definitely. I think a lot of the outcomes that I saw in terms of resistance to COVID lockdowns or social distancing in the Midwest was on the slightly more reasonable end of like at that time, my youngest brother, who I'm very close with, was in his senior year of high school and on the like star of the football team, captain, so proud. But like they would have practice like normal during kind of deep COVID days. And I was just horrified by this, being very much on the taking things quite seriously end of that's close contact if you're in football and wrestling practice. And the arguments against it were not so much, oh, we don't believe that COVID is a thing. It's like the trade-offs are too big to like give up these important experiences in one's life, these formative experiences. And so,
did he ever get COVID?
I think so. Yeah, that he did. Ended up being fine. I think we were very lucky in my family.
I also feel like in general, if you are an overall healthy individual, you might be down for a couple of days. But I mean, there are, of course, and there were some tragic cases where that was not the case. But I think I can see why the football team is like the trade-off is just too big.
Yeah. So that was there was definitely tension in the family around that, and we're otherwise like very, very close. And so I think it's a good reminder for me of like just to always think about like how people perceive trade-offs for their immediate life, especially kind of working in the policy world of there are a lot of there's a lot of thinking around many different policies, and this relates to AI too, of like, oh, people are just misinformed or extremist in their views, but a lot of the times it comes down to just like very different practical strategic calculations of their own for their own lives that play out in very different ways, and we will not always agree on what that is, but like sometimes I definitely think that misinformation is a huge issue. But I think seeing that as the pure source of disagreement and like different interpretations of how to live one's life is not the full picture.
Yeah, it's quite reductive. I guess this would be a good point for us to ask you more about what you're doing now, about the pivot. How did a former diplomat become an AI expert? You kind of returned to academia. And why was that? What happened there? Did you just want to get another degree, or were you actually like, no, I think I'm ready to move on to the next stage in my life?
I had started thinking about quite early on in my internships during undergrad when I was living in Chengdu and interning for the State Department, and being really interested in kind of online censorship practices, what we call the Great Firewall of China. And so I started looking into that. I wrote my undergrad thesis kind of on internet regulation policies in China and Southeast Asia. And so that tech policy interest was there pretty early, and it grew over time, especially as I was in my job doing those 12,000 interviews, speaking to so many different people, traveling to the US for tons of different reasons, but kind of emerging technologies is so core to business, trade, education, and ties between countries. And I was also this is not a dig at any of my colleagues. Everyone's very, very talented, but like broadly the lack of expertise about emerging technologies in governments, kind of writ large, was so deeply concerning to me. And as we were trying to make some very consequential decisions, we were trying to self-study some what is artificial intelligence was very much a question that was asked. And
this was when?
So I was there from 2018 to 2021.
Oh wow, so this is quite early on in the
ChatGPT was not
exactly
this before Sam Altman was even born. Well, ChatGPT
before that persona was born.
Yes, the persona.
Exactly.
That's right.
So AI has been on the sort of radar for big government interests. So since at least 2018, you say?
Yeah, I think on the radar, not super prominent. The rise in prominence, especially in the US, was much more recent and definitely spurred by the release of ChatGPT. But it was something we were definitely, thinking about, especially like living in China, seeing the transportation systems, smart city systems, living in China during this time where kind of at the city level and national level, there were so many kind of digitization efforts being made. And so kind of the rise of smart cities, the rise of smart transportation systems, and kind of living in that trade-off of, that there are so many privacy concerns and otherwise like authoritarian type governance enabling mechanisms throughout those systems, but the convenience was incredible, and being able to transportation worked. I felt very safe around the city, and living each day the trade-offs of knowing like, okay, this does cost me pretty much every ounce of my privacy, but life is very easy. And so trying to keep that daily lived experience in mind now, studying those things. So the pivot was gradual and very planned, and so I knew I needed another degree. I knew I wanted to be an expert, if that is possible in these fields. Really, we people in the like China studies space, especially, there's no such thing as a China expert. So, and I think that definitely applies to AI. So specialist, maybe. I definitely think about these things night and day.
Because there's a lot to cover.
Mm-hmm. No one will ever know even like 2% of all there is to know about China as a country and culture, but kind of same with in a similar way with AI, like it changes so quickly, and there's so many different layers to society and all of the, even if you're focused on different policy issues. So it's a whole like ecosystem and field that's always changing, and you just have to be, I think, focus on being immersed in that field. So that's something I try to keep in mind, of definitely trying to develop expertise, but not trying to be the expert. So